Hey guys, tonight we slip through the flickering torchlight of a drafty stone chamber into a world where being born female isn't just unlucky, it's dangerous. You squint in the dimness, swaddled in scratchy wool and the smell of smoke. A midwife leans over you with trembling hands and a whispered prayer, hoping you'll cry, hoping you're not another tiny corpse for the village priest to bless and bury by morning. You're born in the 1300s, which already puts you at a statistical disadvantage. But congratulations, you're a girl. That's strike one. Your parents wanted a boy to help in the fields and carry the family name. You're a dowry debt waiting to happen. Maybe your mother sighs when she sees you, already calculating how much linen and coin she'll have to save to marry you off. You probably won't survive this century. But don't worry, neither will most of your friends. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and the time where you're listening. I love seeing where my sleepy travelers come from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink in the torchlight. Your life begins in blood. Childbirth in medieval Europe is not ideal. There's no sterile environment, no epidural, no handy chart on the wall reminding your midwife to wash her hands. If anything, you're lucky if the midwife isn't also your neighbor who occasionally sells turnips at the market. Infant mortality hovers around 30 to 50%, and girls, those squishy, underappreciated heirs to nothing, are sometimes left to die quietly in the night. Historians still argue whether female infanticide was widespread or just whispered about in cloistered corners, but there's enough grim poetry about the daughter that never suckled to make you wonder. If you survive day one, you're wrapped tightly in cloth to straighten your limbs and ward off demons. This swaddling lasts months. You can't even move your arms, let alone crawl. It's like medieval sleep paralysis, but cozy. Your cradle may be shared with a sibling, a cat, or, if your parents are wealthy enough, a wet nurse's baby. If you're born noble, you're treated more like fragile porcelain. That sounds better than it is. It just means you're a political chess piece from the womb. There's a good chance someone already proposed to you before you were out of diapers. If you're poor, your birth is mostly noted with a shrug, and you're immediately part of your mother's burden. The church weighs in early. Baptism happens fast, often within hours, because babies die fast. The priest intones Latin over your squirming, slippery body, dabs holy water on your tiny forehead, and boom, welcome to original sin. You're now spiritually clean, but still a second-class soul. Medieval theologians, Augustine among them, debated whether women were spiritually weaker. Hint: most of them landed on yes. Your mother isn't off the hook either. She's considered impure for 40 days after giving birth to you. It's called churching, and it's basically a postnatal quarantine meets purification ritual. She'll be reintroduced to the community once the priest deems her clean. Until then, she's sort of ghosted. And if she died giving birth to you, you'll be passed off to someone else, assuming you survive the next few weeks. Let's not forget the real kicker. You don't have a legal identity, not really. You're your father's property until you're a wife. Then you belong to your husband. In between, you're like a pawn floating in purgatory, unable to make contracts, own land, or decide your own fate. Your life is being shaped around you before you even grow teeth. There's also the superstition stew. Being born under certain stars, during eclipses, or with birthmarks could brand you as cursed. Or, oddly enough, gifted. If you cry too loudly, someone might mutter about changelings and fairies. One quirky tidbit. Midwives were sometimes instructed to taste the baby's tongue to make sure they weren't a demon in disguise. Yep, that was a thing. Don't ask how that helped. Your name? Not even guaranteed. Girls were more likely to go unnamed if they died early, and sometimes just called damsel or girl until age 5 or 6. Meanwhile, boys got saint names, fancy baptisms, and a family sword to inherit. Eventually. As you grow, you'll realize quickly that being a girl means expectations and limitations. You're taught early not to speak too much, not to look men in the eye, not to eat more than your share. Even your toys prepare you for future servitude. Mini brooms, tiny churns, dollies you can marry off. You're rehearsing for a life of labor and silence before you even hit double digits. And if you're wondering, yes, boys notice. You're teased for being weak, told to stop complaining, and reminded that your opinions are optional. By age 5, you already know that loud girls get punished and quiet girls get praised. Let's not gloss over the fashion. You're bundled in layers. A linen shift, maybe a wool kirtle, all cinched with itchy ties. No cute toddler clothes here. Just mini versions of what your mother wears, minus the head covering. Girls over 7? They start covering their hair, especially in pious towns, because apparently your wispy baby hair is too seductive for the public. And medicine? Medieval medicine is mostly, try not to die. If you get sick as a girl, treatments range from herbal brews to prayers to weird rituals involving roasted mice or crushed emeralds. Yes, someone might literally press a gemstone to your head to draw out a fever. Good luck with that. By the time you're 6, you've probably seen a sibling die. By 8, you've helped shroud a corpse. Death isn't hidden from you. It's part of the wallpaper. Every toll of the church bell, every smell of beeswax and incense at Mass reminds you that you're mortal. And your status, your ability to marry well, serve well, obey well, is a life raft in this constant churn of danger. Your story's just beginning, and already it's heavy. But that's medieval girlhood, if you're lucky enough to live through it. You're a few weeks old, and survival is still a gamble. Your mother, sleep-deprived and sore from childbirth, cradles you in one arm while trying to stir porridge with the other. The fire crackles weakly in the hearth, and the chill seeps through the wattle and daub walls. You're crying. Again. Is it hunger? Wind? A stomach full of medieval microbes? No one really knows. But your feeding time is now, and whether you live or die might hinge on one thing: milk. If your mother is alive and healthy enough to nurse you, congratulations. You've already beaten one of the first house rules of the Middle Ages. But don't get too comfortable. Breastfeeding is a full-time job, and your mother still has chores to do, a household to run, and, depending on your family's status, a few more children tugging at her skirts. Enter the wet nurse. In many towns and villages, especially among the merchant and noble classes, wet nurses were the go-to milk solution. They were often poor women with strong lactation records. Yes, that was a thing. And hired to nurse upper-class infants. Sounds like a win-win? Sort of. Except those same wet nurses were often blamed when a baby fell ill or died. And if you were the wet nurse's own child? Well, sorry. You might be weaned early or even neglected while she fed someone else's kid, because that's where the money came from. Historians still argue whether wet nursing was more dangerous for the baby or for the nurse herself. Both, probably. You, as the baby, could easily contract diseases from the nurse, or suffer malnutrition if her milk didn't suit your constitution, whatever that meant in 1347. You're also up against some pretty bizarre beliefs about breastfeeding. For one thing, medieval folks thought personality traits could be passed through milk. If your nurse was cranky, immoral, or even had the wrong astrological sign, it was believed her milk could make you grow up the same way. So noble families could be weirdly picky. Some would ask about the nurse's diet, her moods, even her dreams. Talk about HR overreach. And then there's the timing. People believed that feeding a baby too soon after birth could be dangerous because the first milk might be toxic. This early milk, called colostrum today, is actually full of vital nutrients and antibodies, but back then, some saw it as dirty or impure. So your first meals might have been honey, goat's milk, or even a wine-soaked sponge. You probably didn't like any of them. Of course, if you were born into poverty, your mother probably breastfed you herself while working. Peasant women had no maternity leave. She might tie you to her back or lay you in the field while she sowed barley, sneaking feedings when she could. It's not glamorous, it's survival. One quirky tidbit. In some regions, mothers believed eating certain foods would flavor their milk. So if your mom had garlic soup, brace yourself. And in other cases, she might avoid certain herbs, fearing they'd dry her up. Sage, mint, and parsley were often suspect. Milk was treated almost like a magical potion. Fragile, personal, and potentially deadly. If your mother dies in childbirth and no wet nurse is found, or your family can't afford one, you might end up with animal milk. Cow or goat, usually, though sheep's milk shows up in records, too. It's poured into rudimentary feeding vessels, like hollowed-out horns or clay bottles with linen spouts. Try not to picture the bacteria swimming in those. They weren't exactly sterilized. Even the act of feeding came with judgment. The church and moralists liked to weigh in, because of course they did. A good mother breastfed her child herself. To pass the task to someone else, especially out of vanity or convenience, was seen as selfish or even sinful. But at the same time, noble women were expected to stay slim and ready for courtly duties, and breastfeeding could delay menstruation, thus interfering with getting pregnant again. So yeah, mixed messages all around. By the time you're 6 months old, you're probably being weaned onto mush made from grain and water. If you're rich, maybe there's a drizzle of almond milk or a splash of broth. If you're poor, it's whatever's on hand. Bread soaked in ale, ground beans, porridge that's more water than oat. Your tiny digestive system is not thrilled. And forget bibs or high chairs. You're fed on laps or on the floor, probably with fingers instead of spoons. Germ theory hasn't been invented, so no one's worried about washing hands before feeding you, which helps explain why so many infants died of what were then called fluxes, basically diarrhea and vomiting from foodborne illness. By your first birthday, if you make it that far, you're seen less as a fragile miracle and more as a household recruit in training. Weaning is done, milk is over, and the expectation is that you'll start learning your place. If you're noble, that means servants start teaching you how to sit, how to serve, how to smile. If you're not, well, time to crawl towards a broom. There's a strange duality to infancy in the Middle Ages. On one hand, children are seen as innocent, closer to angels than adults. On the other hand, no one writes parenting books, and you're basically on your own if you get sick. If your teeth come in late, someone might smear ashes on your gums. If you cry too much, you might be dosed with poppy water, a medieval sedative that, in some cases, killed more babies than it calmed. And even if you're healthy, your parents might not get too attached. With infant mortality so high, many families took an emotionally distant approach. There's debate among scholars about this. Some argue that parents loved deeply, but simply didn't show it in the same way. Others believe emotional detachment was a kind of self-preservation. Either way, your early years are rough. Milk was your first gamble, your first lifeline, and possibly your first betrayal, depending on who fed you and how clean the cup was. You're not even walking yet, and already the world has made you earn your place in it. One day, you'll move from milk to meat, from cradle to kitchen, but only if you can stay alive that long. By the time you're 5 or 6, you've already begun your quiet rehearsal for adult life. Not in school? Don't be silly. Unless you're the daughter of a noble or a merchant with serious ambitions, books are for boys. You're being trained to obey, to serve, to soften your voice when men speak. Your hands start to memorize tasks, plucking chickens, spinning wool, folding linen so neatly your grandmother would approve. You don't question it. You barely even notice it. It's just life. But soon, the whispers begin. "She's nearly of age," someone says. "Maybe when you're 8. They're not talking about voting or learning to read. No, they're discussing your future husband, tiny wife, big dowry. You're not even old enough to understand love, and already your fate is being stitched into marriage contracts. If your family has money, or more accurately, land, your hand becomes currency. The dowry your parents save isn't a wedding gift. It's a bribe. One that must be large enough to make someone want the burden of another mouth to feed and another womb to manage. Historians still argue whether medieval girls were always married this young, or whether those were just the extreme cases. But the records are clear. Noble girls were often betrothed before puberty, sometimes married by age 12. That's about the time you start looking less like a toddler and more like a bargaining chip. There's no young love phase, no hand-holding by the river. Instead, there's your father negotiating over cups of ale, discussing things like bloodlines, acreage, and alliances. You are not present. You are not consulted. You are the prize, not the player. And once the marriage is arranged, the countdown begins. Your family starts preparing your dowry chest, sometimes called a hope chest, though there's not much hope in it. It's filled with sheets, spinning tools, maybe a holy book if you're lucky, and fabric you've probably helped embroider. Each stitch says, "I'm useful." Each thread screams, "Please don't send me back." A fringe detail? In some regions, particularly in Italy and parts of France, dowries were so expensive that fathers with multiple daughters would send some to convents just to avoid bankruptcy. Love didn't really get a vote in this process. And if your family isn't wealthy, the pressure's somehow worse. Without a dowry, your chances of marriage drop dramatically, so your parents might spend years scraping together goods just to get one man to say yes. That could mean selling land, downgrading their meals, or putting your brothers to work earlier, all to make you marriage material. You feel it, even if no one says it out loud. Your existence is expensive. You might think marrying young means skipping all the scary adult stuff. But the truth? You'll be expected to act like a full-grown woman on day 1. You'll be sent into a household you've never visited, with in-laws you barely know, to serve a husband who might be 30, 40, or even older. He could be kind, or cruel, or indifferent. Medieval marriage contracts didn't include personality clauses. What they did include were clauses about your virginity. Because yes, that's a major selling point. Your value is tied to the assumption that you've never been touched. Like a fresh loaf of bread no one's bitten into yet. The proof is often demanded in blood, literally, on the wedding night. We'll talk more about that in the next section. But just know this. You're being groomed for a test you didn't sign up for. And school? It's optional at best. If you're lucky, your mother or a local nun might teach you to read the Psalms. But mostly, you're taught the female arts. Spinning, sewing, milking, baking, praying, keeping your head down, and knowing when to pretend not to hear insults. There's a deep, bone-worn silence that surrounds you. Women don't speak freely. Laughter is allowed in soft tones. You're praised for obedience and punished for independence. Even small acts of rebellion, a raised eyebrow, a skipped chore, are met with scolding or worse. One quirky tidbit here. In some households, young girls were made to sleep with their future dowry items, like spinning wheels or combs, to bond with them. It's oddly touching, and also a little creepy. Imagine cuddling a rolling pin instead of a teddy bear. If you're noble, you might be sent to another household for training. Basically a long, fancy internship where you watch older women manage estates and learn how to supervise servants. If you're poor, You might be fostered out as a servant yourself, sent to scrub someone else's floors while your parents keep your wages. Either way, it's preparation for a life of service, not self-discovery. And yet, there's a strange pride that seeps in with the dread. When your mother shows you how to bake bread or patch a tunic, there's love in her hands, even if the lesson is survival. You sense she's teaching you how to endure, not just perform. There's also companionship. You and the other girls in your village or estate swap stories, giggle when the boys walk by, share whispered prayers and pluck lice from each other's hair. It's not glamorous, but it's solidarity. You cling to it. Still, the pressure builds. Every missed step in a dance, every wrinkled smock, every question you ask that wasn't invited, it's all noticed. You are constantly being evaluated, not for your intellect, your humor, or your dreams, but for your potential to bear children and obey orders. By 10 or 11, you may already be betrothed. You may have a ring on your finger and your dowry half-packed. You may be staring down a life with a man you've never spoken to. You may lie awake at night wondering what it feels like to kiss someone, only to wake up knowing it won't matter. Your lips belong to someone else now. You aren't a child, but you aren't quite a woman. You're something in between, a transaction in progress. And no one asks what you want. Your wedding day arrives, and it's less about joy and more about logistics. You wake before sunrise to have your hair braided. Tight, intricate, ceremonial, and probably painful. Ants swarm around you like bees, fastening pins, muttering blessings, and stuffing you into layers of wool or linen. Your dress might be new if your family has means, or it might be borrowed and hastily altered. Either way, it's not designed for comfort. Your hands tremble slightly as someone slips a veil over your head. Not because you're nervous about love. Again, love isn't really on the schedule, but because you know what happens tonight. Or at least, you've heard the whispers. The ceremony itself is short. If you're lucky, it's in a church. If not, it might take place at your new husband's doorstep. Yes, really. Some customs simply required a public vow and a priest's nod. You say the words you were told to memorize. You hold the ring, let it be slid onto your finger. You glance sideways at the man you're supposed to call husband. He doesn't smile. That's fine. You wouldn't know what to do with warmth right now anyway. You've heard what happens next, but no one has explained it clearly. There's no sex education, just vague warnings about pain, blood, and the importance of proof. That's the heart of your wedding night. Not romance, not intimacy, proof. There must be a bloodstain on the sheets, or you could be accused of arriving used. This isn't just about honor, it's financial. If your husband believes you weren't a virgin, he could send you back to your family in disgrace, and the dowry might be forfeited. Your parents would lose their investment. You would lose everything. Historians still argue whether these blood tests were universal or symbolic, but there are enough records to suggest that in many cases the bed sheets were publicly inspected. Sometimes they were even displayed the next morning. Sleep tight. If no blood appears, well, the explanations don't matter. Your fear, his incompetence, nature, none of it matters. You could be labeled impure, and that stain, or lack of it, could define your life. Quirky twist? In some places, brides would secretly prick a finger or sneakily add blood to the sheet. A bit of medieval stagecraft, if you will. The stakes were just that high. So there you are, a child in a wedding gown, lying stiffly in a stranger's bed. Maybe he's kind and awkward. Maybe he's drunk and demanding. Maybe he just wants to get it over with so the witnesses can go home. You might cry, you might go numb, you might disassociate so hard that you later forget entire parts of the evening. But in the morning, you are no longer a girl. You are a wife. And being a wife isn't about cuddles or shared dreams. It's about fertility. Almost immediately, you're expected to conceive. No pressure or anything. It's just the one job you literally cannot afford to fail. If you're noble, your body becomes a political tool. The goal is to produce male heirs. If you're poor, the goal is to provide helping hands for the fields or the home. Either way, the uterus is now on a schedule. There's no pregnancy test, obviously. You find out by waiting. If your courses stop, if your appetite shifts, if you start throwing up in the mornings, the household begins to whisper. And once it's confirmed, everything you do is scrutinized. Did you lift a bucket of water? You might miscarry. Did you eat eel? That's dangerous. Did you sit too close to the fire? That might cook the baby. No, really, people believed that. One fringe belief. Some medieval texts claimed that a woman's mood during pregnancy could etch emotions onto the child. So if you were angry, you might give birth to a furious baby. Feel sad? Watch out for a melancholy infant. You can imagine how helpful that kind of guilt is while your ankles swell and you're throwing up bile into a bucket. Labor, when it comes, is brutal. There are no epidurals, no sterile delivery rooms, just a group of women, midwives, maybe a neighbor or two, gathered around, shouting encouragements and prayers. You bite down on a rag and hope you survive. Remember, every birth is a gamble. You could bleed out, the baby could be breech, infection could set in, one wrong move and your story ends here. And if the baby is born dead, you're expected to try again as soon as possible. Some husbands are gentle during this process, others are impatient, demanding more sons, more heirs, more proof that you are doing your job. Your feelings? Not really relevant. If the baby survives, congratulations, you're not done. Now you're expected to nurse it, unless you can afford a wet nurse, rock it, bathe it in sometimes icy water. Yes, it was thought to strengthen the body, and carry it while still cooking dinner and spinning thread. You don't have postpartum leave. You don't even have a term for postpartum depression. You might be grieving, aching, exhausted, and bleeding. But you are expected to smile when visitors come to bless the new bundle. You are barely 15. And your body already carries the wear of decades. You don't complain. Complaining doesn't change anything. You just do the work. And if you don't, there's always someone ready to say you're a bad wife, a failed woman, a problem. Your husband might take a mistress, not scandalous, expected, especially if you fail to give him sons. You're supposed to tolerate it, maybe even pretend not to notice, but you do notice. You notice everything. And you tuck it away, quietly, because being a wife in the Middle Ages isn't about being seen or heard. It's about being endured. You wake before the sun, slip your feet into stiff shoes, and shuffle through the chill to light the hearth. Your fingers fumble with flint and kindling, and your breath fogs the air. The baby stirs in its cradle, and your body aches in all the usual places. Back, breasts, knees, hips. Nothing's ever fully healed, and no one expects it to. This is life now. Married life isn't glamorous. It's endless motion. Feeding chickens, mending tunics, fetching water, boiling porridge, nursing children, and pretending you aren't unraveling inside. You move through your tasks like someone underwater, slow, silent, and nearly invisible. That invisibility? It's a survival strategy. When you're quiet, people forget to scold you. Your worth is measured in chores completed and mouths fed. No one thanks you. No one notices you unless something goes wrong. One day, the bread burns, or the baby cries too long, or you forget to stir the pottage at just the right hour, and suddenly, your name is being hissed, your character questioned. Lazy, someone mutters. Useless, someone else might add. Historians still argue whether women in peasant households had more freedom than their noble counterparts. On one hand, poor women worked alongside their husbands in the fields, shared labor, and often took on significant responsibility. On the other hand, their lives were harder, rougher, and more openly policed. There was no room to hide in a peasant's cottage, so you learn to endure. You also learn how to stretch food further than it should go. You know that herbs like parsley and fennel help with digestion. You know that a single egg can be split between 4 hungry children if you use enough barley. You know how to dry nettles and thistles to make a kind of bitter soup in hard times. A quirky little tidbit? Some women placed toads in their aprons or buried them near the hearth to ward off illness. Superstitious, sure, but when your kids keep catching fevers and the local doctor suggests drilling holes in their skulls, you'll take your luck wherever you can find it. And when the village gets sick, because they always do thanks to contaminated wells, spoiled meat, or one unlucky cough, you're the one who keeps moving. You gather herbs, boil water, clean wounds with vinegar or ale. You sit beside feverish bodies and whisper prayers to saints whose names you barely remember. If they live, it's a miracle. If they die, you're expected to bury the grief deep and keep the hearth fire going. You can't afford to be sentimental. When your husband is away, maybe plowing fields, maybe marching off to some distant lord's skirmish, you carry both his duties and your own. No one adjusts your schedule. No one gives you a medal. If anything, your neighbors might raise their eyebrows and mutter about whether you can handle it all. But you do. Because what choice do you have? You're not alone in this struggle, though. There's a quiet sisterhood in the village, a network of women who help each other when no one else will. Midwives who pass down secrets in hushed voices. Elder women who teach you how to bind a wound or staunch a nosebleed. A friend who distracts the steward while you sneak a handful of oats for your baby. You don't have therapists or support groups or weekend getaways, but you do have women who know exactly what it feels like to weep silently while churning butter. And sometimes, if you're lucky, there are rare moments of levity. When the children are asleep and the chores are briefly done, you gather with other women around a fire. You tell stories, often bawdy and full of exaggeration. You laugh, not loud enough to wake the men, of course, but enough to remind yourselves you're still human. But the laughter never lasts long. It's quickly muffled by another cry, another chore, another man calling for wine. Marriage doesn't get easier with time. Your body breaks down. Teeth fall out early from poor nutrition. Your joints swell. Your eyesight fades. And still, the demands don't stop. Your husband might grow distant or angry or tired of your aging face. There are no marriage counselors in the 1300s. No date nights. If your husband is cruel, you live in fear. If he's decent, you simply coexist. 2 cogs in the same grim machine. If he dies, people might actually congratulate you. A widow, after all, has some rights. You can own property, control your own money, at least a little. Of course, the freedom is bittersweet. It comes at the cost of mourning, of social scrutiny, and often of being pressured to remarry. Still, some widows manage to carve out space for themselves. They run businesses, tend gardens, brew ale, or become midwives. It's one of the only paths to independence. But it's never easy. Even religion doesn't offer much comfort. The church tells you that women are daughters of Eve, cursed with sin, naturally weaker, emotionally unstable, and spiritually dangerous. Your suffering is expected, even encouraged. It's how you earn salvation. A well-known sermon from the era described women as the door of the devil and warned men to be wary of female influence. Inspiring, right? You attend Mass, of course. You have to. But when the priest talks about obedience and purity, you sometimes let your mind drift. You wonder if he's ever held a dying child or scraped frost off the inside of a cooking pot. You wonder if God is even listening. And then you go back to work, because no one else is going to haul the water, bake the bread, wash the tunics, patch the roofs, soothe the crying baby, pluck the lice, grind the flour, mend the fence, and keep the entire household from collapsing. You're not a heroine. You're not a saint. You're not remembered in scrolls or sung about in ballads. You're just a woman trying to survive one more winter, one more pregnancy, one more insult whispered behind your back. But you're still standing. Somehow. The seasons change, but your routine does not. Winter brings cold that creeps into your bones, settling behind your eyes like a constant ache. You wake up and your breath fogs in the air. There's ice in the water bucket, frost on the inside of the windows, and your hands go numb before you even touch the broom. You wrap your feet in cloth, wear layers of threadbare wool, and still feel the sting in your toes for hours. Laundry freezes on the line. The hearth never quite warms the room. And through it all, you're expected to keep everything running. Because medieval women don't get snow days. Food becomes more than a chore. It becomes a battle. You ration what's left from the autumn harvest. Root vegetables, dried peas, cured meat if you're lucky. Mostly, you make pottage, an eternal stew that lives in the pot, never fully emptied, just added to day by day. You might flavor it with a bone if you have one. Maybe wild garlic if you braved the cold to dig some up. The flavor isn't the point, survival is. And through the hunger and cold, you still spin wool, patch clothing, and tend to the animals. You lean over the fire to stir dinner, and the smoke stings your eyes until they water. No chimneys, just a smoke hole, if that. Your lungs ache, but you've gotten used to it. Mostly. Historians still argue whether women were economically invisible or just underrecorded in medieval documents. Either way, your work isn't officially noted. No scroll mentions that you kept 3 children alive through winter with nothing but oats, willpower, and prayer. No one paints a fresco of you defrosting the butter with your body heat. You are history's background character, essential, but unnamed. You don't have gloves, but you have calluses. And tricks. Like that one about onion skins. Did you know women used to save them to dye cloth during the long winters? A strange little way to bring color into an otherwise gray world. Or how some women placed pots of hot coals under their skirts to stay warm while sitting, risking burns just to feel their thighs again. Quirky? Maybe. Desperate? Definitely. Spring, when it finally arrives, isn't a celebration. It's a race. Everything must be planted. The earth needs turning, the seeds must go in, the tools must be mended, and the animals coaxed into producing more. And guess who's doing all of that? You are. Alongside the men, sure, but no one's handing out gold stars. You lift the same buckets, dig the same trenches, haul the same manure, all while keeping your children alive and your household moving. And when they praise the harvest later, they won't say your name. Insects return with the thaw. Lice, fleas, and flies. You become an expert at scratching without looking obvious. The kids squirm constantly. You boil their tunics when you can, but lice are winning this war. You accept it. You have bigger problems, like childbirth season. More babies are born in the spring and summer. It's biology. Easier to conceive when the body isn't frozen, and safer to give birth when the world isn't buried in snow. But that also means midwives are run ragged. And you, if you're expecting again, are just one more name on their long list. You help where you can, even when it's not your turn. You hold hands, boil cloth, wash blood from the floor with bitter herbs. You know what it's like to scream into a mattress, and what it's like to lose too much blood and still have to smile when the neighbors come to coo. Women bleed out every year. Infection sets in. Babies arrive too soon or the wrong way. And still, the cycle continues. God's will, they say. You've learned not to flinch when you hear that. Summer brings heat, and with it, rot. Food spoils quickly, flies swarm, children get fevers, and sometimes they just don't get better. You pray to Saint Margaret, patron of childbirth, and Saint Apollonia for the toothaches. But the saints are busy, or deaf, or testing you. You bury your dead with your own hands, or your neighbor's child, or your sister's. The dirt is always ready. People think the plague is the worst thing that could happen, and yes, it's horrifying when it comes. Black boils, oozing sores, death in days. But in truth, medieval women already live in a kind of slow-moving disaster. The plague is just a louder version. Historians still debate the true death toll of women during outbreaks, especially because many records lump us in without names or counts. But we know this: women were more likely to care for the sick, which meant they were also more likely to die from it. But even in times of peace, summer is grueling. You walk miles for firewood. You cook over open flames while sweat trickles down your back. You harvest grain, cut hay, stomp grapes if you're lucky enough to be near a vineyard. You get stung, burned, scratched, and still smile for the priest when he passes by. You attend holy days, not because you want rest, but because it's one of the only chances to sit still and not be questioned. Your hands clasp in prayer, but your mind drifts to the chores still waiting at home. And when autumn rolls around again, you barely notice. Just another rotation of labor, another cycle of survival. No one asks how you are. You wouldn't know how to answer anyway. You measure time in bruises, in loaves of bread, in the soft snores of children who made it another night. You remember joys, sure, your daughter's first word, the way your husband once brought you a piece of honeycomb, the rare feeling of warm bath water. But those moments pass quickly. There's no glory in your life, no song, but it is still yours. And every day you wake up and do it again, that's its own kind of power. Quiet, unseen, but real. The years roll forward, but your place stays the same. You've memorized the creak of the floorboards, the weight of your bucket when it's half full, the exact temperature when dough begins to rise in the hearth's outer edge. Your hands don't just work. They remember. There's a rhythm now, like a song you never asked to learn but can't forget. Still, just when you think you've adjusted, the expectations shift again. If you're part of the merchant or artisan class, somewhere above peasants but below nobles, you face an entirely different kind of invisible weight. People imagine that town life is easier, cleaner, that having a roof that doesn't leak means you don't suffer. But that's a lie wrapped in brick. You live above the shop, probably a narrow timber structure that groans whenever someone walks across the floor. The air always smells like something. Metal from your husband's forge, tallow from the candle shop, vinegar from the pickling barrels. Whatever it is, it clings to your skin and hair until even your dreams smell like work. You don't run the business, on paper, but in practice, you're the glue. Your husband works the forge or talks with merchants, but you're the one tracking inventory in your head, haggling with customers when he's out, chasing deliveries when the apprentice forgets. Historians still argue whether medieval women in towns had genuine economic agency or were simply doing unpaid labor under male names. But there's no debate in your household. Without you, the whole place collapses. You don't get paid, but you get blamed when something breaks. Classic. Meanwhile, society tightens the leash. With each passing decade, urban women find themselves subject to stricter guild rules, fewer rights to inherit businesses, and growing scrutiny from male-dominated church and court systems. A quirky historical tidbit? In some towns, married women couldn't legally own a broom. Why? Because brooms implied a stall or service, and that meant money, and money meant power. So naturally, the law stepped in to say, no, thanks. You're constantly reminded that your value lies in obedience, modesty, and quiet service. If you're too clever, they call you arrogant, too outspoken, and it's improper. Too involved in your husband's trade? Suspicious, possibly witchy. You exist on a tightrope, balancing grace and grit. And you're aging. Not that anyone gives you credit for it. You're no crone yet, but the bloom is fading, and people start looking at you sideways. Like maybe your time is up. Like maybe the younger girls should be stepping in. You see them too. Girls with their flushed cheeks and hopeful eyes, their giggles in the market square, their terror during their first bleeding. You want to shake them, or hug them, or warn them. But you don't. They wouldn't listen yet. They're still caught in the fantasy. The church, always looming, doubles down on controlling your life. Priests preach about temptation, urging husbands to guard their wives like property. Confession becomes an obligation, not a comfort. You're told to confess impure thoughts, but when you mention how exhausted you are or how unfair your life feels, they call it pride. A common sermon tells you, woman is like a bent rib, weak, curved, and easily broken. Charming. And yet you still go. Not because you believe all of it, but because you need the structure. The sacred calendar gives shape to the blur. Candlemas, Lent, Easter, Whitsun, days to measure your toil against. And the nuns? Well, they're a complicated sort. Some are just as harsh as the priests, stern women with tight lips and tighter rules. But others are your lifeline. They copy herbal remedies in secret books. They teach daughters to read behind closed doors. They stitch prayers into the seams of your tunics. Quiet rebels with thimbles and ink. Historians still debate whether the convent was a prison or a haven. Truth is, it depends who you ask. For some women, it was salvation, a space with education, autonomy, and safety. For others, it was exile. For you? It's a dream you were never offered, because your path was chosen before you bled for the first time. Marriage, children, duty. Sometimes you catch a whiff of freedom, when you barter at the market alone, or when your husband falls asleep early, and you stand by the window looking out at the moonlit street. You let yourself imagine a world where you made different choices, where choices existed at all. But then the baby cries, or the door creaks, or someone calls your name, and the fantasy folds back in on itself like the corner of a worn bedsheet. There's gossip in town now. A woman was caught brewing ale without a license. Another accused of being too familiar with the bishop's clerk. People love a scandal, especially when it involves a woman stepping even a toe outside her prescribed lines. You keep your head down, you smile just enough. You blend in. You know what happens to women who stand out. The last one to raise her voice too often? Sent to the stocks for disruptive behavior, which is just code for men didn't like her tone. And yet there's a weird sort of pride in the invisible lines you've walked. You've kept your family fed, taught your children to read with letters scratched into dirt, helped birth babies and bury parents, memorized the stars to know when to plant, managed a business you'll never get credit for, and survived every plague, rumor, insult, and misfortune hurled at you like rotten fruit. You've done it with cracked hands, missing teeth, and a spine that refuses to stay straight. But you've done it. No one will write your name. No one will carve your likeness into stained glass. But your impact echoes through bread baked, clothes mended, children raised, and stories whispered to daughters at dusk. And in those whispered stories, sometimes, just sometimes, you add a little hope. A hint that life won't always be like this. That one day maybe women won't have to shrink to survive. That one day, someone might even tell your story. Your bones ache before the sun even rises. By now, you're no stranger to the weight of age, though no one would call you old, at least not kindly. You've likely outlived some children, maybe a husband, maybe two, and yet your role hasn't lessened. If anything, it's sharpened. You're a mother, yes, a widow, perhaps. But in this town, you're also something else. A gatekeeper of propriety. A living relic of how things should be according to the men in robes and the women who've bought into their sermons. Because now you're responsible not just for your own virtue, but for policing the younger women too. There's pressure to watch their hem lengths, their curfews, the way they look at boys. You're expected to scold and warn and correct. Sometimes you do, because it's what's expected. Other times, you let things slide, just a little smirk behind a veil, because you remember what it was like to want more than the world said you could have. But when the town crier announces a sumptuary law, again, it's your job to enforce it. You remind the girls they can't wear silk unless they're nobility, that only married women should show their hair, that red shoes are for whores. You say it without blinking, even if you once dreamed of red shoes yourself. Sumptuary laws were the medieval world's way of gatekeeping fashion. Quirky, right? You couldn't just wear what you wanted. The color of your cloak was a public confession of your class. And heaven forbid you dress above your station. That was considered theft, of appearance, of identity, of control. Historians still argue whether these laws were genuinely enforced or mostly symbolic. But in your life, they were just one more rule in a fortress of rules. And each one whispered the same message: stay where you belong. Meanwhile, your duties pile higher. You're likely a midwife now, or at least someone who knows which herbs to steep for cramps and how to feel for a baby's position through swollen skin. You've held hands through more labors than you can count. Sometimes it ends in laughter. Sometimes it ends in screams that go quiet too soon. The church increasingly mistrusts your knowledge. Herbalism, midwifery, moon cycles, they're all starting to look suspicious to the men in charge. What used to be considered women's wisdom now brushes dangerously close to witchcraft. You feel the shift. That neighbor you used to share calendula salve with? She's been avoiding your eye. That younger woman you taught how to identify feverfew in the hedgerows? Her husband says he doesn't want her getting ideas. And when a child in the village dies from illness, someone mumbles about bad air, but another looks pointedly at you. You want to laugh or scream. You want to ask, do you know how many lives I've saved? But you don't. You just keep walking, head bowed, fingers dusted with crushed sage. Because you've learned the hard way. No one fears a woman until she knows too much. Your daughters, if you've been blessed or cursed with them, are now at marrying age. You try to guide them, to offer bits of wisdom between chores. Don't trust a man who smiles too quickly. Never go into the woods alone. Hide some coin in your hem, just in case. But the world teaches them its own lessons, and you can't shield them from all of it. You watch them walk down the same narrow paths you once did, toward betrothal, childbirth, and housewifery. You hope their burdens will be lighter. You know they won't be. You remember your own mother, now gone for years, and the way she used to knead dough like she was wringing the world's neck. You thought she was angry. Maybe she was. Or maybe, like you, she just needed to put her rage somewhere. Funny thing is, even with everything, the work, the pain, the loss, you've also learned to laugh. You laugh with the women at the well when someone drops a bucket in too deep and curses like a sailor. You laugh when your neighbor's rooster accidentally struts into mass. You laugh when you find a rat in the flower and pretend it's a gift from Saint. Gertrude, patron saint of cats and, strangely, also of mice. A fringe fact. Some medieval women actually prayed to Saint Gertrude to help with rodent problems, Others just swung a broom and shouted, "You do both, just to be sure." And in those moments, between the heaviness, you remember that joy can survive even here. You sit by the fire one night, watching the flames dance like a secret language, and you realize you've outlasted expectations. You weren't meant to live this long. You weren't meant to question. You weren't meant to know this much. But you did. And you do. You've learned to keep secrets about where the best nettles grow, about how to bargain with the baker's wife when no one's looking, about how to turn sorrow into strength. And you know now that while the men tell history, the women carry it. In the baskets we weave, in the scars we hide, in the songs we hum while scrubbing ash from pewter. You pass these down in whispers, not books. You write your legacy into the calluses of your descendants. And though your knees pop when you kneel and your eyesight's fading by candlelight, you feel, strangely, like you've become more powerful in the shadows. Not because the world respects you more, but because you no longer need it to. The church bell tolls at dawn again, and you rise before your body agrees to it. Your joints argue, your back mutinies, and your feet have long since given up filing complaints. But still, you move. Because you must. Because even now, even after decades of obedience, the work is never done. Your hair is mostly gray now, what's left of it tucked beneath a plain linen coif. You used to fuss with braids, maybe a ribbon on feast days. Now it's about function, not flair. You've earned the right to be invisible, and you wear it like armor. By this point, you're either a widow or dangerously close. Statistically, men die younger than women, especially in times of war, plague, or poor hygiene, which is all the time. And widowhood, believe it or not, can be a strange kind of freedom. You finally live without a man's constant oversight. No one is shouting if the bread is late. No one is stealing your wages or deciding your worth by your womb. You can speak a little louder, walk a little slower, even take in laundry or brewing jobs, assuming the guild doesn't protest, under your own name. But it's not all peace and quiet, because now you walk a tightrope between respectable elder and suspicious old crone. The town watches you closely. If you smile too much, you're hiding something. If you frown, you're bitter. If your cat follows you too loyally, you're cursed. And if someone falls ill after drinking your elderberry tonic, well, it was only a matter of time before someone accused you of something unnatural. Historians still argue whether the rise in witch accusations stemmed more from religious fervor or political control. Either way, you feel it in your bones. Because the rules for older women? They change. Suddenly, the same skills that once made you wise, herbal knowledge, midwifery, even literacy, now mark you as dangerous. A quirky fact. Some women in parts of Germany were legally banned from speaking to strangers on Tuesdays if they'd been accused of gossip or maleficium, witchcraft. Tuesdays. Imagine timing your socializing around potential hangings. So you learn to quiet yourself again. You bow slightly more. You speak less in public. But in private, you burn rosemary at your threshold. You teach your granddaughter how to mix a poultice without making a sound. You tell her, under your breath, which churchmen lie and which ones cry in the confessional. Because knowledge, real knowledge, has to go somewhere. And if it can't be spoken aloud, it must be whispered. Still, the fear never leaves. You've seen women dragged before the town court over bad weather, accused of hexing someone's crops just because they had an argument 3 months prior. You've watched as frightened people turned on the very women who had once delivered their children, healed their infections, cooked their wedding feasts. You know better than to think you're safe. All it takes is one wrong look, one failed harvest, one frightened priest who misreads your silence as spell work. And yet, in this twilight of your life, there's also something strangely unburdened. You no longer try to please the world. You no longer believe that your worth is tied to how small you can make yourself. You've seen too much. You've seen women give birth standing up because there wasn't time to lie down. You've seen children buried in shallow graves because winter came early. You've seen a young girl's face light up when she held her first quill, even if the ink stained her sleeves. You've seen it all, and somehow you're still here. The younger women come to you now, quietly, at night sometimes. They ask questions they can't ask their husbands. They ask about birth pains, or bleeding, or what to do when a man takes more than he's given. You answer as best you can. You become the village's living archive. No one says it, but everyone knows. You remember the name of every midwife who taught you. The smell of every plague herb hung above every door. You remember which fields yield the best yarrow, and which people were kind when they didn't have to be. And somewhere in all that memory is a soft kind of power. Not the kind that swings swords or signs laws, but the kind that survives, that teaches survival. Because when men draw maps, they trace rivers and borders. But when women draw maps, they trace memories, where the grief is buried, where the joy still lingers, where the danger hides in plain sight. You map your world in lullabies and nettle tea, in laughter over cracked bowls, in the rhythm of sweeping ash off the hearth and whispering stories to a sleepy child who thinks the world might be safe, just because you're sitting beside them. You're not famous, but you're remembered, in calloused hands and second-hand prayers, in recipes scrawled on scraps, in the way your granddaughter knots her apron strings, twice, just like you taught her. You're still not allowed to vote, or own land, or preach. But somehow you've shaped a dozen lives just by living yours. That's the irony, isn't it? You were never meant to matter. Not by the church or the court or the chroniclers who think history means kings and crusades. But here you are, a keystone in 100 quiet stories. And even if no one writes your name in the monastery's illuminated scrolls, they'll carry your wisdom in their bones. So tonight, as you sit beside the hearth for what feels like the 100th winter, you close your eyes and breathe in the scent of thyme and ash. You hear the wind tapping at the shutters. You feel the weight of a life fully lived, however brutal, however brilliant. You survived it all. And in this world, that is its own kind of rebellion. You wake in darkness, but not the kind that frightens you anymore. It's the soft, velvety dark before dawn, where silence feels sacred and even the chickens haven't stirred. Your hands move without thinking, reaching for the worn shawl, tying it around your shoulders, knotting it the way you've done for 30 years. The wool smells of wood smoke, thyme, and a hint of stubbornness. Because yes, you've become stubborn. You kind of have to be, don't you? Life didn't get easier. It just got more predictable in its brutality. At your age, you've earned a strange kind of visibility and invisibility at the same time. The town no longer flirts with you. Men don't leer anymore. Well, most of them. Boys no longer tease you in the streets. But that doesn't mean you're safe, because now you've become the embodiment of what scares them. A woman with no leash, no husband, no filter. That can be dangerous. You still remember the last time someone called you wise in public. It was a compliment. But it was also a warning, because there's a very fine line between wise woman and witch, and in the medieval mind, the two often blurred. Historians still argue whether women accused of witchcraft were targeted more for being healers, outcasts, or simply inconvenient. The truth is probably a mix. But you know one thing for sure. It rarely had anything to do with spells. No, it was about control, It was about silencing women who didn't beg, or bend, or stay small. And now it's your turn to walk that knife's edge. You still practice your craft, the quiet kind. You dry herbs and whisper to babies and stitch wounds with more skill than the local barber, who thinks leeches are a one-size-fits-all miracle. You do it because you must, because no one else will. You remember being taught by women who came before. A crooked-backed neighbor who showed you which leaves stopped bleeding. An aunt who recited herbal chants in a half-Latin, half-nonsense rhythm. A friend who could tell if a fever would break just by touching the soles of your feet. Some of those women are dead now. Some just vanished. And in your heart, you suspect the world did not let them leave gently. So you carry their knowledge like sacred fire. You teach only those you trust, and even then, only in pieces. Not out of pride, but out of fear, because you've seen what happens to women who know too much, too fast. There was that girl last spring, barely 15, bright eyes, asked too many questions about blood and bones. You warned her to keep quiet. She didn't. Now she's away, some say in service at a far-off estate. Others whisper darker things. The church doesn't need evidence, just suspicion. Just one bad harvest. One stillbirth. One man feeling humiliated in front of a crowd. And suddenly, you're being asked why you own so many jars, why your door always smells like sage, and why that woman you treated walked with a limp afterward. You've prepared for this. You keep a small bundle hidden beneath the floor. Dried lavender, coins, a saint's medal you don't believe in, and a sprig of rue. It's not an escape plan, just comfort. A reminder that if they come for you, you've at least claimed some piece of yourself. It's strange, isn't it? How survival becomes its own ritual. You eat the same gruel each morning. You thank the fire when it lights on the first try. You kiss the carved wooden amulet that's hung beside your bed since the day your youngest died. You don't believe it protects you anymore, but you like the way the grooves feel beneath your lips. There's peace in small repetitions. Outside, the world continues its usual chaos. War whispers on the wind, always somewhere else, but never far. The plague hasn't struck this village in a few years, but you never trust quiet periods. You keep cloves and vinegar-soaked rags on hand just in case. Another quirky detail? During outbreaks, some women carried posy bouquets in their sleeves, not for beauty, but to ward off the bad air. They'd sniff the flowers when passing corpses or visiting the sick. You still do this sometimes. Habit, really. Or maybe hope. There's a girl who visits you every few days. Marga, the baker's niece. She's 17, curious, sharp as thistle. She wants to learn the women's ways, as she calls them. You pretend to grumble, but secretly you're proud. You recognize yourself in her stubborn jaw. You teach her slowly, patiently, how to tie up comfrey root, how to recognize a lying man by his shoes, how to hold a crying mother's hand without asking questions. You know she won't be safe, not truly, but at least she'll be ready. And maybe that's the best you can offer the girls who come next. Readiness, not rescue. Because you've realized, painfully, that no one is coming to save you. Or them. There is no knight, no priest, no potion strong enough to undo a world built on keeping women afraid. So instead, you pass down resistance like a secret recipe. One whisper at a time, one nettle tea at a time, one quiet correction of a brutal rule. No, a girl can walk alone if she carries a sharp pin in her sleeve. No, blood is not a curse, it is power. No, silence is not always virtue. Sometimes it's survival. You look back on your own life now, your girlhood, your marriages, your griefs, and you wonder how you've endured it all. Then you realize it wasn't endurance, it was defiance. Every time you kept going, every time you laughed, even when you weren't supposed to, every time you made something, bread, balm, beauty, out of what the world left you. That was defiance. That was a kind of witchcraft, too. And now, as you sit beneath the cold sky, wrapping your shawl tighter, hearing the first crows begin to call, you feel no fear. You've outlived their stories. You've written your own in the soil, the smoke, and the stories passed over kneading dough and brushing hair. You are not what they said you were. You are what survived Sharp A. You're older now. You feel it in your knees, in your hips, in the way your breath gets caught just before the rain. Your days begin slower, your steps measured, your thoughts sometimes looping back to places you'd hoped to forget. But your mind is still sharp. And that's both a gift and a curse, depending on who you ask. Because in a medieval world that doesn't much care for elderly women, unless they're baking or burying someone, having opinions and sharing them is a risky business. Once, long ago, you might have worried about sounding too bold. Now, you mostly worry about your firewood supply and whether the town's well water is making the children sick again. There's a strange dignity in being dismissed. Men don't ask for your thoughts anymore, but younger women still do. Sometimes even men's wives come under the pretense of sharing eggs, only to stay an hour and pour out their fears like grain onto a table. You listen. You always listen, because you know what it feels like to not be heard. You spent half your life being spoken over, told what was true, what was holy, what was safe. Most of it wasn't. You've reached the stage where you can say things like, "That priest never liked women who talked," and people will chuckle nervously instead of scolding you. But beneath the smile, you still watch for flickers of suspicion, because one accusation, just one, is enough to unravel everything. Historians still argue whether late medieval Europe was a worse time for older women than earlier centuries, but you feel the shift like a weight in your ribs. As male-dominated medicine rises, midwives lose ground. As inquisitors sharpen their rhetoric, herbalists like you become targets. There was a time when women were the default caretakers of the body and soul. Now, that role is being taken, pushed, out of their hands. You remember the whispers, that midwives were dirty, that female healers spread illness rather than curing it. A man with a bone saw and a leech jar? Trusted. A woman with peppermint oil and steady hands? Suspect. It's enough to make you laugh. Quietly. Bitterly. A quirky fact? In one 14th century Italian town, healers had to wear red crosses stitched into their cloaks to signify they weren't practicing unlawfully. Of course, those laws only applied to women. So you've adjusted. You don't call yourself a healer anymore. You're just a helper. Just a woman who's seen a lot. Just someone who knows where the fever breaks and where it doesn't. But you still keep your old satchel packed and ready, tied with a string that's frayed but not broken. Inside, thyme, mint, ground chamomile, a needle, a pinch of powdered willow bark, a sliver of soap, and the one comb you've owned since you were a teenager. Each item wrapped in oilcloth like a relic. Sometimes you dream of using them in peace. Other times you dream of fire, because fear still lingers here. In your bones, in your neighbors, in the night air, even the safest seeming moment can unravel in a breath. Remember Merritt, the seamstress? Accused of poisoning her husband's stew. No one asked why the man had bruises, just that she had too many dried roots hanging in her cellar, or that she read too much for a woman who couldn't afford books. She was lucky. Banished instead of burned. Though luck is relative when you're left with no name and no home. You saw her once after that. Just once. Hair shorn, eyes dull, begging near the market gate. You gave her a coin. She flinched at your kindness. You never saw her again. So yes, you've learned to stay wary, but not silent. Because what no one tells you is that the voice inside you, the one they tried to smother with years of labor and prayer and silence, it doesn't actually die. It waits. And when you're older, and no one's watching too closely anymore, it rises. You find yourself telling the truth more freely, not shouting, but weaving it into stories, into lullabies, into casual remarks by the oven fire. You tell girls that bleeding doesn't mean shame. You tell boys that strength isn't the same as cruelty. You tell anyone who will listen that justice doesn't always come from the loudest men in the room. And if no one listens, you tell the hens. They're quieter company, but more loyal. There's something comforting in the routine now. You spend your mornings tending herbs and your afternoons helping with births or fevers. You teach Marga to grind marigold with mortar and patience. You tie up rose hips in cloth and tell tales that are half history, half spell. Every evening you light a candle before a wooden carving of St. Bridget, not because you believe she's watching, but because she feels like a friend. You sit by the window and watch the sun dip behind the thatched roofs. You listen for the crunch of boots on gravel. You count the hours by how long it takes your stew to cool. And every so often you remember what it was to be 16. How it felt to run barefoot. To laugh so hard your ribs hurt. To dance on feast days with someone who smelled like apples and sweat. The memories sting less now. They feel like old letters, yellowed and softened by time. You're not bitter. You're tired, sure, but not bitter. You know that for every child you lost, every bruise you hid, every time you were told no, some piece of you endured anyway. And that endurance is its own kind of legacy. Not the kind written in books, but in other women's eyes. In the steady hands of apprentices. In the way Marga now moves like you. Quick, quiet, careful. So tonight, as the wind hums through the shutter slats and your fire sighs low in the hearth, you settle into your chair, press your palms together, and breathe. Not a prayer, not exactly. Just a breath. You're still here. And that, after all of it, is more than anyone ever expected. You don't remember the last time you felt warm all the way through. Not just your skin, but your bones. The deep warmth that lingers past the firelight. That kind you only got as a girl when you curled up in fresh hay and let the sun bake your hair until it smelled of summer. Now, your warmth comes in fleeting moments. A cup of nettle broth, a borrowed blanket from a kind soul, a half smile from someone who doesn't look at you like a problem waiting to be solved. You're what they call a widow woman now, an identity given more weight than your first name. Funny how you never chose that word, but now it follows you like a shadow. There's a strange power in widowhood, though. You're no longer someone's daughter, wife, or possession. You're a woman alone, and that makes people nervous. See, a married woman has rules, a daughter has guardians, a nun has God. But a widow? A widow's loyalty floats untethered, and that makes you dangerous. Not in the sword-swinging way. You don't ride into battle. But you know things. You know which roots relieve a cough before it turns into death. You know what a bruise shaped like a boot heel means. You know when someone's lying about how much grain they harvested. Historians still argue whether widows in medieval society were pitied or feared more. Probably both. One moment you're seen as pitiable, alone, poor, fragile. The next, you're whispered about in doorways as though you've grown horns in the night. Because a woman who has buried a husband and survived, she's tasted freedom, and that taste lingers. You still visit your husband's grave sometimes, not often. Not because you didn't care, but because the earth there has nothing new to say. He wasn't cruel, just there. He did what men were taught to do. Work hard, speak loud, and make decisions without asking. You don't hate him, but you don't miss him either. You do miss his boots, though. They were good boots. You still wear them when it rains. After he died, the village didn't know what to do with you. At first they offered you help, kind words, a few stale pies. But when it became clear you weren't going to remarry or move in with a cousin, they stopped bringing food and started bringing questions. What will you do now? Who will protect you? Are you managing all right? Translation: how long until you cause a problem? You never did cause one, not in the way they feared. You just kept living. Quietly, steadily, inconveniently. Some days you chop wood until your arms shake. Other days you trade dried herbs for a bit of cheese. You mend your shawl with the same careful stitches you use on torn skin. You survive. A quirky historical note. Some towns forced widows to wear black for the rest of their lives, not as a sign of mourning, but as a visual cue for others to avoid attachment. Widowhood wasn't just grief. It was a public identity, stamped on your body like a scarlet letter. You never wore black. Not for long. It made you feel like a shadow. Instead, you wear mossy greens and slate blues, colors of earth and sky, colors that don't beg for attention but still claim space. Sometimes you imagine what your life would have been if you'd never married. It's hard to picture. In this world, unmarried women past a certain age are either cloistered or cursed. But sometimes, in your more rebellious moods, you picture a tiny hut in the woods. No husband, no in-laws, just you, a cat, and a small garden full of secrets. That's the life they warn young girls not to want. Because it means wanting freedom. And freedom for a medieval woman is always suspect. Even now, the local priest still asks if you'd consider coming to confession more often. He doesn't say it outright, but you hear it in his tone. Repentance would make your independence more tolerable. You nod politely, but you don't go. You confess to your fire, to your pillow, to the seeds you scatter into the cold ground each spring, not knowing if they'll bloom. You do feel guilt sometimes, but not for the usual things. You feel guilty for the women you couldn't help, for the herbs that didn't work, for the advice that came too late, for surviving when others didn't. That kind of guilt doesn't get washed away in holy water. Still, you move through your days with purpose. You keep a small calendar scratched onto a piece of bark. Just tick marks, mostly. But you know which days are the new moon, which days bring danger, which days bring hope. You still teach Marga and a few other brave girls. You teach them to listen. Not just with ears, but with skin, with instincts. With that sixth sense, women grow when the world keeps trying to trick them. You teach them not to be fearless, but to move through fear like a river, finding the path of least resistance but never stopping. You don't tell them your full story. Not yet. Not until they're ready. But you do give them pieces. The name of a flower that dulls pain. A story about a woman who escaped across the river in the middle of the night. The knowledge that your name is your own, and no one gets to write it for you. At night, you sometimes light 2 candles instead of 1. One for yourself. One for all the women who didn't make it this far. You whisper their names, or just the sounds of them, because some names have been lost to the silence history prefers. You don't need anyone to remember you in 100 years. That was never the goal. You just need to be heard tonight. You just need the air to hold your story, even if it's only for a moment. Because being forgotten is not the worst thing. The worst thing is being remembered wrong. You hear the first cries before sunrise, a sharp, panicked wail, tiny, fresh, urgent. It slices through the fog and wakes you like a bell toll. That sound means only one thing. Another baby has been born, and you already know where you're going. Your satchel's by the door, as always. Tucked inside are your usual tools: a bone needle, linen strips, dried nettle, and comfrey root, a sliver of beeswax, a ribbon for luck, and the one thing you never leave behind, a prayer whispered into a twist of cloth, even if you don't fully believe it anymore. The labor has ended, but your work has just begun. The house smells like blood and barley. The mother lies motionless on the straw-stuffed mattress, her breath thin, her skin like chalk. The baby, tiny, reddish, angry, is nestled beside her, but no one's holding him yet. You kneel by the fire, warm a cloth, and begin. You clean the mother first, gently, reverently. She's still halfway between worlds, and if you press too hard, you're afraid you'll tip her into the wrong one. Her name is Helna. She's only 16. You whisper soft nothings, half lullaby, half spell. Things you don't even realize you're saying until they've left your lips. It's not the words that heal, really. It's the rhythm, the presence, the fact that someone stays. The child makes it. The mother, barely. And you stay until her color starts to return, like blush on a frozen apple. Now, you're not technically allowed to do any of this. You're not a licensed midwife. Though, to be fair, licensing for women's work in this era is mostly a joke told by men in robes who wouldn't know a uterus from a turnip. Historians still argue whether medieval midwives were trusted community figures or resented outliers. The truth, as always, lives somewhere in the gray. You're both healer and heretic, depending on who's talking and whether the moon is full. The church tolerates you. Barely. They send warnings in the form of sermons, veiled references to wise women who play God. Once, a monk slipped you a paper scroll warning you to cease unnatural practices. You used it to wrap time. But the people, they come to you anyway, because while monks pray and doctors bleed, you save babies. And mothers. And sometimes yourself. Childbirth in your world is a dice game played in the dark. No matter how skilled the hands, no matter how clean the linens or how steady the breath, some women slip away. You've lost count of how many times you've closed a mother's eyes. That never gets easier. But you've learned how to do it kindly, gently, slowly, with hands that don't shake and a whisper that forgives them for leaving. You light a candle, not to mourn, but to honor. You place a sprig of yarrow beside it. And then you go home and scrub your hands raw, because the weight of it has to be washed off before it settles in your bones. A quirky fact? Some women in medieval Germany carried special birthing amulets, tiny carved figurines of saints or goddesses, tied to their undergarments during labor. You've seen one once. It was shaped like a woman cradling her belly. You wanted to weep just looking at it. You wish magic like that worked. But you've learned that the only real magic is stubbornness, clean water, and staying awake when everyone else has collapsed. The church talks about miracles like they're rare. You see them every week, in the first breath of a newborn, in a mother's cry of relief, in the way a child's hand instinctively curls around your finger, as if to say, "I'm here. Don't let me go." Some men say you meddle with fate. But if fate involves letting a woman bleed out while they debate doctrine, then yes, you meddle. You're not ashamed. Still, you keep your notes hidden. Your formulas, your remedies, your drawings of the womb and its secret chambers, all tucked into the hollow of an old bread oven in your cottage wall. Safe, quiet. You're not ready to burn for them. Not yet. You spend your evenings training Marga to cut cord and swaddle properly. She learns quickly. Her hands are better than yours now, faster, more nimble. Sometimes you watch her and feel something dangerously close to pride. But pride is a slippery emotion for a woman. Too much, and people call you arrogant. Too little, and you forget who you are. You let yourself feel it anyway, in small bursts, like candlelight. Enough to see by, but not enough to draw too much attention. You also teach her how to talk to the dying. That's an art of its own. Most people get it wrong. They rush in with noise and false hope. You've learned to just sit, to offer touch, to say things like, "You can rest now," and "We'll remember your name." Simple words, sacred ones. Because in your world, a name spoken is a life extended. You still remember the ones who didn't make it, like Etta, whose labor lasted 3 days before her heart gave out. Or Lene, whose husband refused to pay for herbs because he thought rare was enough. Or young Berta, who simply bled and bled and bled until she didn't. You say their names sometimes, when no one's listening. You don't know if they hear. But you hear. And that matters. You sometimes wonder what the world would be like if women ran the healing halls. If the church bowed to birth instead of fearing it. If your tools were hung on walls of honor instead of hidden in cupboards like weapons. But dreaming too much can get a woman in trouble. So instead, you stay busy. You walk, you fetch, you mix. You hum lullabies that aren't yours, inherited from the midwife who taught you before she vanished during a witch hunt 20 winters ago. And when the baby you helped deliver this morning finally falls asleep in his mother's arms, you feel something like peace rise in your chest. It's fleeting, like fog in the sunlight, but it's real. You tuck it away in your memory, next to the smell of lavender and the sound of a first cry you've earned it. You smell fire before you see the smoke. At first it's just a twinge in your nose. Wood smoke, maybe. But sharper, dirtier. Then the scent curls into your lungs, acrid and thick, and your stomach drops before your feet even move. You run, barefoot across frost-stiff grass, dodging chicken feathers and cracked pottery because your instincts don't wait for logic. Something is burning, and you already know it's not just a home, it's a warning. When you reach the square, your breath knots in your throat. It's not your cottage, thank the saints. But it might as well be. It's Aldreda's. Or it was. Now it's a heap of blackened wood, charred herbs, a shattered stool, and smoke that hangs in the air like an accusation. You see her, what's left of her, curled in on herself like a scorched question mark. They didn't even let her die whole. You were just with her 2 nights ago, trading remedies, gossiping like hens over stale wine, laughing about the priest's pious gasps when someone dared say the word menstruation. Now she's ash. Aldreda, the clever one, the stubborn one, the one who always said she'd outlive every man in the parish by sheer spite. Gone. You try to scream, but it comes out silent. The kind of silence that fills you up from the inside and makes a home between your ribs. A guard stands by the ruin, arms crossed, not watching for safety, watching for spectacle. Because this wasn't just arson, it was a message. "Witch," someone whispers behind you. "They said she hexed the baker's child." You don't turn around. You know the voice. You know they're lying. The baker's child had a cold. You gave her elderflower tea and told her mother to let her rest. It worked. The girl recovered. But someone needed a scapegoat. And Aldreda had no husband, no father, no son, no one to argue for her humanity. Historians still argue whether witch trials were about religion, politics, or just misogyny dressed in holy robes. You already know the answer. They never burn the ones with powerful husbands. You go home that night and pull up every root near your doorway. Anything that might look unusual. You bury your notebook beneath your hearthstones. You brush the ash from your hair and sit still, heart hammering, until the moon shifts in the sky. You survive this time, but only by hiding who you are. And you hate it. You hate it because being careful doesn't always work. You hate it because even if you say nothing, they still see your silence as suspicious. You hate it because every time you quiet your truth, you lose a little piece of it. And most of all, you hate it because Aldreda deserved better. She deserved to die of old age, swaddled in wool, surrounded by sleepy grandchildren and shelves of dried sage. Not this. You sit in the dark and pick wax from your nails and wonder how many more of you will disappear before someone says, "Enough." A quirky historical tidbit. In some parts of Europe, women were accused of witchcraft for knowing how tides worked. Tides. Apparently, understanding the moon could get you tied to a stake. You can't help but chuckle. Bitter and low. Imagine being burned because you understood the sea. Then again, you've seen people punished for less. One girl was accused because she healed a dog's limp, another for carving symbols into a loaf of bread, her grandmother's recipe meant to ward off illness, another because she wore red too often. All of them vanished within weeks. You try not to think about it too much. You've learned how grief works. It wears many faces: rage, silence, prayer, and sometimes bitter laughter that echoes longer than a scream. Tonight, you choose rage, not loud, dramatic rage. Number, that's too easy to notice. You choose the quiet kind, the kind that makes you teach Marga even faster, that makes you sharpen your knowledge like a blade, that makes you sew protective charms into your sleeves and bake messages into your bread. You learn the signs. You learn when it's time to speak and when it's time to disappear. Because survival, for a woman like you, isn't about staying loud. It's about staying alive long enough to whisper your truth into someone else's ear. That's what Aldreda did. Her secrets live in you now. Her formulas, her stories, her sharp tongue and softer heart. You carry her like a flame in your chest, careful but never extinguished. And if they come for you next, well, you've got your escape bag ready. It's always ready. It contains dried apples, a flint, a cloak, a small pouch of silver coins, and 3 pieces of paper inked with names, maps, and the places where women still help each other in secret. You hope you never need it. But if you do, you'll run. Not because you're afraid, but because you're not done yet. You have too many girls left to teach. Too many stories left to pass on. Too many hands still reaching for help in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, if enough of you stay alive, the fire won't win. You fall asleep that night with Aldreda's name on your tongue. Softly. Not with sorrow, but with reverence. You don't forget your dead. You speak them. Because if memory is a spell, then this is how you cast it. You say her name, and then you say your own, out loud, like you're daring the world to silence you again. You dream of water that night. Dark, endless, pulsing with things unseen. Women's voices rising and falling like waves. Ancient chants wrapped in wind. Lullabies stretched across centuries. You dream of hands beneath the surface, reaching up, not to pull you under, but to hold you steady. When you wake, the morning is cold, but not cruel. There's a letter under your door. You don't open it immediately. First, you check the hearth, feed the fire, wrap your shawl tighter, and sip from your cracked mug. Then, slowly, like you're touching something sacred, you unfold the parchment. It's from Lenore. You smile despite yourself. Lenore was your first apprentice. Wild-haired, half-feral, always asking why the sky moved that way or why certain mushrooms bloomed in death-shaded hollows. She left years ago, traveling east toward the forests and deeper secrets. Now she writes in small, slanted script. It's working. The women here remember. They gather in moonlight, they sing the old names. No one burns. Your throat tightens. She includes a recipe, too, a pain tonic using pine bark and clover milk, and you swear you can smell it through the ink. You whisper a thank you to whatever stars kept her safe. You keep every letter, because when the world tries to erase you, proof matters. That afternoon, a neighbor's girl shows up at your door, red-faced and shaking, not from fear, but from fury. They took her, she chokes. My sister, because she tried to grow garlic near the church wall. You blink. Garlic? Garlic, she repeats. Apparently it offends God. You sigh. Not because you're surprised, but because, of course, garlic is the new enemy. Historians still argue whether such bans were rooted in superstition or control. You suspect both. After all, nothing terrifies a bishop like a woman who cures things he can't pronounce. You tell the girl to sit. You brew tea with mint and juniper. You ask her questions, not just about what happened, but about what she knows, what she's seen, because you recognize that fire behind her eyes, and you know how to train it. Her name is Bess, and by nightfall, she's pacing your cottage reciting which herbs slow bleeding and which ones make a man sleep for 6 hours. She's a quick study. You tuck a sprig of rue into her braid and whisper, "For protection." She grins like she already believes in her own power. This is how it begins every time. One woman falls, one rises, the chain continues. A quirky fact. In medieval Iceland, women could challenge their accusers in court, but only if they could recite a complete genealogical record from memory. Imagine trying to save your life by naming 15 generations of cousins before lunch. It sounds absurd. And yet you wonder, what if memory is armor? You teach Bess to memorize names, herbs, hymns, and old stories. Not because you expect her to need them in court, but because knowledge is the one thing they can't burn. You remember what happened to Eldreda, of course. You always will. But you're learning to carry grief differently now. Not as a weight, but as a seed. You plant it. You let it bloom into something that might outlive you. The next time you walk into town, you walk taller. It helps that your knees no longer ache like they did in winter. It also helps that Marga walks beside you, her satchel full of supplies. Bess trailing close behind with questions spilling from her lips like bird song. People notice. Some frown. Others nod. One woman passes you and presses a folded note into your palm. It reads, "My daughter's belly is growing. Come when the rooster crows twice. You don't need more details. You show up 3 days later just in time to help coax a breech baby into the world with a whispered rhyme and a well-timed push. The baby is stubborn, the mother stronger. You wrap them both in lavender steam and fresh linens. You leave the house lighter than you entered. There's something you haven't felt in a long while. Momentum. Not safety, that's too far-fetched. But movement. The sense that maybe, just maybe, the scales are tilting. You begin teaching again in earnest, not just Marga and Bess now. Others join. A widow who speaks 4 languages. A baker's wife who knows every plant that grows in shade. A child no older than 10 who can identify any bird call within 2 heartbeats. You call them your circle. Not out loud. Never out loud. But when you kneel in the garden beneath moonlight and light your little candle stub, you whisper it to the soil. My circle. And when they whisper it back, in the rustle of time and the shifting branches, you feel something ancient awaken. Power, maybe. Or just hope. It's fragile, of course. You don't get careless. You still keep your escape bag packed. You still avoid the priest's gaze. You still feign ignorance when asked about the tonic that healed the mayor's mysterious growth last spring. But within your walls, there is laughter now. There is purpose. And when Marga hands Bess a swaddle, she's stitched herself. Perfect seams, reinforced edges. You feel something in your chest ache. In the good way, like a wound closing. You used to dream of fleeing, of escaping into the woods, vanishing like smoke, living out your days with only moss and mushrooms for company. You still might someday, but not today. Today, you're needed. And there's something fierce about being needed, even in a world that wants you gone. So you grind roots, you boil water, you scribble notes in the margins of old psalters, pretending to read scripture when really You're writing instructions for stopping hemorrhage with nettle vinegar and sheep's wool. This is your heresy. Healing. You can live with that. Because when the next woman knocks at your door, eyes wide, voice shaking, clutching her belly, you'll answer, and you'll save her. Again. You don't light a candle tonight. Instead, you sit in the dark, letting your eyes adjust, letting the silence settle. Your cottage smells of crushed yarrow and something sharp, maybe vinegar left uncorked. The fire crackles low, and in its flicker, shadows crawl across your ceiling like old friends. Marga is asleep in the loft. Bess, too. You can hear her snoring softly. She's grown into herself fast. Quicker than you did, even. There's something in this new generation, this crop of women. They're done asking permission. You sip from a mug of bitter nettle brew and let your mind wander to the last village meeting. Funny, isn't it, how quickly the priest's sermons have shifted in tone. Just last year, he was warning of demons and herbs and women who read too much. Now he's thanking you for curing his cousin's plague boils. Historians still argue whether the church's evolving stance on women healers was a calculated move or a sign of slow enlightenment. You suspect it was mostly cowardice, masked as mercy. Power doesn't like a losing hand. You think of Aldreda. Again, you always do in these quiet hours. But this time you smile. Because this week, a girl down the lane used Aldreda's wormwood trick to calm her mother's shaking hands. And it worked. You didn't even teach her that one. Marga did. The knowledge is spreading. And with it, something deeper. Trust. Tonight the world feels just slightly less cruel. But you know better than to get too comfortable. Because for all the warmth in your circle, danger still presses at the edges like cold air under a door. That morning, someone left a charm nailed to your fence. 3 dried crow's feet, tied with a red ribbon. You knew what it meant? Someone sees you, wants to remind you. You plucked it down calmly, burned it in your hearth, and added a few protective lines in chalk around your threshold. But still, it stuck with you. Not the threat. Those are easy to spot. It was the cowardice. They didn't even knock. So the next day, you visit the market with Bess and Marga, bold as ever. You buy turnips, talk too loudly, laugh even louder, because fear shrinks you. And you're done shrinking. In fact, when you pass the priest, you don't just nod, you wink. The poor man drops his loaf of bread. A quirky fact? In the 13th century, a female doctor in Bologna taught anatomy at a university. Yes, taught. Some records claim her students were all male. Others say she gave lectures behind a curtain to preserve modesty. Either way, she existed, and that changes everything. You tell this story to Bess, who immediately wants to know what happened to her. You shrug. She vanished from the records, probably married, or died, or just got tired. Bess nods. We should carve her name into something. You agree. You decide to start a list. Every woman the world tried to forget, carved into the beams above your hearth. You start with Aldreda, then your mother, then the herbalist who taught you how to tell poison hemlock from parsley. Soon, the wood holds dozens of names, every one of them a spell, home nights. You read them aloud like a prayer, not in mourning, but in defiance. Names matter. Remember how you learned about the Icelandic woman who had to recite her ancestors to claim her place in court? You're doing the same, just louder. The days pass, filled with quiet miracles. You cure a newborn's cough with honeyed sage. You soothe a soldier's scars with calendula balm. You even charm a traveling merchant into trading 6 bolts of cloth for 3 jars of mushroom tincture, though you suspect the cloth was moth-eaten and he just liked your smile. You're not just surviving anymore. You're crafting your place here. Slowly, the community softens. The baker's wife starts leaving scraps of bread on your windowsill. The blacksmith asks you about his daughter's fevers. Even the most skeptical women, those tight-lipped ones who once crossed themselves when you walked by, now linger by your door with thin excuses and eyes full of questions. Just curious, they say. You let them be curious. And then, when they're ready, you teach them. Sometimes it's how to ease a labor. Sometimes it's how to dry out a toothache. Sometimes it's just how to listen, because pain, as you've learned, rarely starts in the body. One woman comes to you just to sit in silence. You give her lavender tea and hold her hand. That's all. And it's enough. There's a joy in this, a stubborn, aching, brilliant joy, because you know you're doing something your mother never got to do, that Aldreda never got to do. You're planting the future while still alive to water it. And oh, how it grows. The circle now stretches past the village. You get letters from nearby hamlets. Girls come walking for hours just to sit by your hearth and watch you chop roots. Some want to learn. Others want to remember. You don't turn any of them away. There's a girl with webbed fingers. Another with a stammer. One who smells like pine and never speaks but draws symbols in ash. You love them all, not like daughters. Not exactly. More like pieces of a puzzle you've been assembling your whole life, each one falling into place with a quiet click of recognition. Together you are strange, dangerous, unholy, according to some. But to each other, you are home. One night, Marga takes your hand. Do you ever wish you'd left, gone off into the forest and disappeared? You think for a moment, then shake your head. Not anymore. And it's true. You no longer dream of escape. You dream of expansion, of spreading wider, deeper, like mycelium underfoot. Quiet, but unstoppable. Not everyone wants you here, but enough do. And enough is enough. Rain taps against the thatch like drumming fingers, and the morning light slides in pale and uncertain. You've barely slept. Too many dreams, too many whispers, the sort that cling even after waking. You rise anyway, because these days, rest feels like a luxury, and need never sleeps. Outside, the path is slick with mud. Bess is already gathering nettles at the edge of the woods, shawl soaked, cheeks flushed with purpose. She waves without looking up. You smile. She's ready. You know it in your bones. The same way you once knew when a storm was coming, or when a fever would break. There's a rhythm to everything, and she's stepping into it like she was born for it. Which, honestly, she probably was. The circle has grown beyond what you ever expected. Women come and go now like tides, some staying for a season, some just for a story or a single salve. And with every arrival, your knowledge deepens. Because this is the secret they never wanted you to learn. Wisdom is communal. It was never meant to live in just one mind. It thrives in echoes. And now, those echoes are everywhere. Of course, not everyone's thrilled about this little revolution. Just last week, a noblewoman's steward arrived unannounced. Polished boots, feathered hat, and a list of questions tucked under his arm. You knew the type, smiling too much, asking too little that wasn't already a trap. He wanted a fertility charm. Quietly, of course, for his mistress, who happened to be his cousin's wife, which he explained with absolutely no shame. You sold him dried basil and told him to boil it under a waxing moon. It won't work. But you know what? That's not your problem. Some folks don't want healing. They want loopholes. And you're not in the loophole business. Still, you felt his eyes scanning your shelves too long, his nose twitching when he passed the dried foxglove, his fingers lingering over your jars like he was memorizing them. You mention this to Marga later, and she frowns. We should rotate the stock, change the order of things, make it harder to catalog. You nod. You start that night, because survival means adaptation, and you've become very good at that. Historians still argue whether the increased legal scrutiny of women's knowledge in the late medieval period was due to genuine fear of witchcraft or simply a crackdown on unlicensed medicine. But you've lived it long enough to know. It's both. Power hates what it can't tax, and you're healing people without permission. Fringe fact of the day. In some parts of 14th century Europe, midwives were required to swear an oath not to use magic during deliveries, while simultaneously being blamed if the baby died. Talk about a no-win job description. You tell this to Bess, who just mutters, "Good thing magic listens to women, not contracts." Exactly. You remember when you used to doubt yourself, those long nights where every failed tincture felt like proof you were a fraud, when a single withered root could spiral you into weeks of second-guessing. Now, you trust your hands. You trust the process, even when it goes sideways, like last month, when a boy drank too much poppy milk and forgot his own name for 2 days. You panicked, prayed, ground fennel and made him chew raw honey until he came back, blinking and confused. You didn't scold him, you just taught the others what went wrong, because every mistake is a spell refined. That's the thing men never understood. They thought knowledge was static, written in ink, locked in books, guarded by bearded gatekeepers. But your knowledge, it breathes. It's passed hand to hand, whispered from mouth to mouth, stored in touch and taste and timing. You don't write recipes, you remember them. In muscle, in scent, in dreams. And dreams have become more important lately. You've started keeping a dream journal, just a scrap of parchment hidden beneath your mattress. Symbols, mostly. Animals, colors, unfamiliar names. Sometimes you wake with a word on your lips that no one recognizes. Sometimes you don't speak it aloud. Sometimes you shouldn't. The land is shifting. You feel it in your bones. Not just the seasons, but the balance. There's a tremble in the air, like something held too long is about to crack open. And it's not just your gut. Birds have begun nesting out of season. A fox gave birth on your doorstep. The village well ran sweet for 3 days last month, then suddenly turned bitter. You asked the priest about it. He said it was God testing them. You think maybe the earth's just tired of being ignored. The girls are restless too, more urgent, more aware. They talk of dreams with matching details, of visions. One of them, June, the baker's niece, woke speaking a dead dialect no one recognized until Marga remembered a line from an old psalter. They translated it together. It said, "The bone remembers, the ash forgives." Make of that what you will. You're not sure where this is headed, but you do know it's headed somewhere. That same night, a rider arrives from 3 villages over. She wears men's clothes, a bow slung across her back, and blood on her sleeves. She doesn't ask. She tells you there's work. A plague again, a different strain. You gather supplies. Bess insists on going with you. So does Marga. You don't argue. You leave a note under your mortar, just in case someone comes looking. It reads, "Gone to heal. Will return if we can." You set out before sunrise. And with every mile, you feel less like prey and more like force. You're not just surviving medieval life anymore. You're reshaping it. With every poultice, every whispered lesson, every stubborn, mud-covered midnight birth you ease into the world. You are undoing centuries, one woman at a time. Your boots are soaked before noon. The road you travel is more wish than path, just 2 muddy tracks flanked by wet brambles and whispering trees. Somewhere behind you, a raven calls out 3 times. Somewhere ahead, a town waits, broken by sickness and held together by fear. The rider, Rihanna, you now know her name, moves like someone used to traveling alone. But she slows her pace for Bess and Marga, checking over her shoulder every so often with a wordless nod. You're grateful. The way she watches the trees makes it feel like you have a shield. "I heard of you," she says at one point. barely audible over the squelch of boots and rain. They said you saved a child from the bone rattle, with linden smoke and goat's breath. You shrug. It wasn't goat's breath, just warm milk and thyme. Still, she says, glancing over, stories spread. They always do. Historians still argue whether the spread of healing women's reputations was primarily oral tradition or community myth-making. But let's be honest. You've seen how fast gossip travels when the ale is good and the bread is warm. Truth has never stood a chance against a good tale. It takes 2 days to reach the village. It smells wrong. Not the rot of unburied dead, that's old news to you. This is wet, acrid, and sweet all at once, like meat gone wrong. You press a cloth to your face and gesture for the others to follow suit. Inside, people barely look up as you arrive. They've already buried too many. You set up in the church, of all places, Rihanna insists. It's empty now. The priest died a week ago. No one wants to go in. They say his ghost moans. You hear no ghosts, but you do see a miracle. The old altar has been stripped of gold and filled with jars of herbs, pots of ash, and bundles of dried lavender. Someone started without you, and sitting behind it, like a queen on a makeshift throne, is an old woman with a single milky eye and a pet crow. "About time," she croaks. "You're late." You stare. She stares back, then grins. "I'm Merla. I taught your teacher's teacher." And just like that, the story gets bigger. Turns out this isn't a one-way mission. This is a convergence. All those names you carved into the beams at home? Turns out some of them are still breathing. You trade knowledge that night. She shows you how to draw infection through steamed mugwort. You show her how to ease lung rot with fermented barley. She tells you a secret about sage and menstrual blood that makes Bess turn crimson and Marga snort into her stew. There is laughter here, in this plague-struck village. Laughter and learning. Who knew? A fringe fact for tonight. Some women in early medieval Iberia left behind herbal charms scratched into the margins of religious texts. Not prayers, recipes, hidden in plain sight, like little green spells tucked between the psalms. Historians still debate if these were scribes, nuns, or just clever housewives who wandered too close to the scriptorium. You think about that as you and Merla press a poultice to a boy's swollen throat. He hasn't spoken in 2 days. His mother won't stop crying. You promise nothing. But you work anyway. Midnight comes. The candle gutters. The boy breathes easier. The mother falls asleep on your shoulder, still clutching your wrist like a lifeline. You stay up watching the shadows stretch and curl on the church ceiling, listening to Merla snore softly beside you. And you wonder how many women kept this same vigil, silent, bone-tired, half-mad with worry and purpose, watching, waiting, hoping their fingers were enough to stitch one more soul to the world. The next day, 5 more fall sick. You don't flinch. You set up quarantine lines using soot and twine. Teach the villagers how to steam water with pine and thyme. Rihanna keeps order with a glance and a knife. Bess and Marga move like wildfire, everywhere at once. It's hard, but it's working. On the 4th day, the dying stops. Not entirely, but enough to breathe, enough to hope. A young girl brings you a toad as thanks. You accept it solemnly. Its name is Clovis. He lives in a gourd now. Even the small kindnesses matter. Because if medieval life has taught you anything, it's this. Dignity is built from scraps. A clean cloth. A song hummed during stitches. A toad named Clovis. That night, you dream of water turning to honey. Of bones blooming like flowers. You wake with the feeling that something old has passed through you and left something behind. You don't speak of it, but Merla sees the look in your eyes. "Yep," she mutters over her breakfast porridge. "You're cracked open now." You don't ask what she means. You already know. It's what happens when you stop being afraid of what you are. It's not just about herbs anymore. Not just about easing coughs and soaking fevers. It's about restoration, of land, of lineage, of you. You're part of something ancient now, not new, just remembered, and you can't unknow it. When the village recovers, they offer coin. You refuse. You ask for stories instead. Names of other women, other places, other fragments. They give you 13. You tuck them away in your mind like seeds. Because the work is never done. And if you're not the one to plant them, someone else will be. You've made sure of that. Your legs ache from riding. Your back is a symphony of knots. You're out of honey down to your last pinch of marigold, and Clovis, the gourd-dwelling toad, has developed an attitude. And yet, you feel more alive than you have in years. The road back winds through bog and forest, threading between villages like a half-forgotten song. You pass ruins overtaken by ivy, fallow fields, a woman burning sage outside a thatched doorway who nods at you with recognition before returning to her smoke. They know you now, not by name, but by role. You're not just a healer, you're a signal. Proof that it's possible to survive this world on your own terms. Historians still argue whether the increasing appearance of wise women in court records during the late Middle Ages was due to growing suspicion or growing influence. You'd say, probably both. Power always notices what it can't control. You make it home by dusk. The cottage is just as you left it. Mossy roof, low stone walls, the faintest scent of rosemary still clinging to the air. But something's different. It takes you a moment to see it. There are offerings on the doorstep. Bundles of thyme, a braid of garlic, a child's crude carving of a fox. They're not gifts for a neighbor. They're tributes. You're the village hedge now, the boundary line between what hurts and what heals. And the line keeps getting wider. Inside, the hearth is cold. You light it easily. The house welcomes you like it remembers. And tucked behind your mortar, just where you left it, is a note, in Bess's looping hand. We added the mint to the east wall. You were right about the sun. Also, a girl came asking for a sleeping charm. I gave her valerian and told her not to read scary stories before bed. Progress? You laugh. She's learning. The next few days move quietly. You rest, you inventory, you coax Clovis out of his gourd with a bit of bread and promise him a larger vessel. Something with windows, maybe? He blinks slowly like he's negotiating. The garden's grown wild in your absence. Calendula reaching past the fence. Dandelion bursting through cracks in the stones. You don't tame it, you thank it. Nature does what it must. You're just here to listen. A fringe tidbit for the curious. In parts of 15th century Eastern Europe, women would sing to their herb gardens to wake the plants. It wasn't superstition, it was intimacy. A soft ritual of connection, half memory, half magic. You find yourself humming now as you harvest. It's not long before visitors return. First, a woman with a swollen foot from stepping on a nail. Then a boy with stubborn warts. Then a tanner with boils, and a shepherd's wife who can't sleep. And suddenly, the quiet week becomes a procession. You don't mind. They arrive with chickens, cider, hand-spun wool, but mostly they arrive with questions. About what to plant, about what's safe, about how to know. You answer what you can, and you teach what you can't. You don't just heal now, you train. Bess leads a session on wound binding. Marga drills the younger girls on plant recognition. You show them how to listen to the body's secrets, the pulse beneath the ear, the heat of the skin, the dreams that repeat. You keep a list now, of all the names, not carved into beams but inked on parchment, tucked behind the spice jars. A living ledger. Some names are crossed out, moved on, or passed on, but most remain. Your circle is growing, and so is the risk. A letter arrives by courier one morning. Fine parchment, red wax, no return mark. The script is too elegant to be friendly. It reads, "Your presence has been noted. Your activities are under review. Cease all unlicensed treatments or face ecclesiastical inquiry." No name, just a seal, a chalice flanked by thorns. You burn it in the hearth. But not before showing the girls. "Let this be your first lesson in fear," you say quietly. It comes dressed in manners. Still, your hands tremble a little when you tuck the ashes under the garden soil. Even now you know how fragile this all is. One accusation, one frightened man, one dead sheep too close to your doorstep, and this sanctuary becomes a pyre. Historians debate whether women like you were more often protected by their communities or scapegoated by them. And honestly, it depends on the harvest, and the mood, and the moon. But lately, you sense something shifting. It's not just the women, it's the land. The soil is sweeter, the birds are louder, foxes aren't hiding, they're watching. And at night, your dreams feel like messages, not from God, from something older, something that remembers. You stop doubting your instincts. You start planting by the stars. You build a second still from discarded brass. You boil a poultice one afternoon, and the steam rises in the shape of a deer. You blink, and it's gone. Or maybe not. Hard to say these days. You've always been told that mystery was dangerous. But maybe it's just another word for freedom. That night, the fire burns blue. No one panics. Clovis croaks once, then settles deeper into his gourd. And you? You close your eyes and whisper a prayer with no words. The kind passed down before language. You're not just surviving, you're rooted. And roots, once deep enough, don't fear the wind. There's a frost on the ground this morning. It's thin, just a silver kiss across the thatch and grass. But it speaks of what's coming. The year leans toward its quiet end. The trees are bare. The garden sleeps. Even Clovis, burrowed deeper into his upgraded clay pot, seems slower, dreamier. And you? You're finally still enough to look. At the home you've made. At the lives you've changed. At the line of muddy footprints outside your door from someone who left before dawn. Someone who once arrived sick and silent, and left with hope stitched into their palms. Winter is a different kind of work, not less, just inward. This is the season of teas and bone broths, of dream herbs and stories passed around the hearth. The girls have taken to calling it the whisper months. You like that? There's something holy about a whisper. Even now, travelers arrive. A merchant's wife from 2 valleys over who heard about your sleep charm. A boy with an injured hawk. A midwife from the coast who brings you seaweed and salted plums. And a recipe for easing birth pain that makes Bess whistle and say, "Why didn't we know this a year ago?" You trade, of course. You always trade. But never for coin. You take secrets, stories, seeds. You take memory. You give healing. But you give other things too. Confidence, curiosity, safety, and sometimes, just permission. Permission for other women to live outside the lines. You've become the thing you once only dreamed of finding. Historians still argue whether communities with strong healing women had higher survival rates during plagues and famines. But what isn't debated? They had stronger bonds, tighter circles, less despair. That matters. That might be everything. A quirky footnote. In parts of early medieval Wales, women who knew too much about plants were required to register with the local reeve, or, failing that, marry a blacksmith. The logic being perhaps that iron-tempered magic. Or maybe that only a man with calloused hands could keep a woman like you from floating off into the sky. It's almost funny. Almost. The sky is where your eyes wander lately. There's a pull in your chest now, a sense that what you've built here is no longer a hiding place. It's a launch pad. One morning, you rise before the others. You slip out past the sleeping herbs, past the girls curled together like fox kits, past the quiet hearth, and you walk up the ridge, past the standing stones, into the oldest part of the forest, where moss hangs like beards from the trees, and everything smells of secrets. And there, beneath an ash tree split by lightning long ago, you dig. Only a little. Only enough to bury 3 things: a worn-out poultice cloth, a broken needle, and the list of names. You don't need it anymore. It's all inside you now. When you return, the house is stirring. Bess is frying something. Marga is wrestling Clovis into a foot bath. Rihanna is sharpening a knife by the fire. You step into the warmth. They look up, and you smile, because you know something they haven't said yet. They're ready for more, for elsewhere. And so are you. It's time. Time to pass this house on. Time to carry the circle forward. Time to leave a few breadcrumbs in the world for the next girl with questions and calloused hands and a toad in her satchel. You don't need to be everywhere. You just need to make sure no one ever feels completely alone. And now, you have an entire generation who knows how to make that happen. The final night in the house is quiet. You light every candle. You thank every corner. You walk the garden barefoot, even though the frost bites your toes. And then you sleep. Not because you're tired, but because you've earned it. The morning sun cracks open the sky like an egg, and you step out the door, satchel packed, eyes wide, heart full. The road ahead doesn't scare you anymore. Because you've walked worse. Because now, there are others behind you. Because this is not the end. It's just the next season. And you are exactly the woman to greet it. Wind down. Final 300 words. The road fades behind you now. You don't look back. Not because you don't care, but because you no longer have to. Your roots stretch beneath you, deep and woven, tangled with the lives you've touched, and the women who will carry your lessons forward like candlelight in cupped hands. The world is softer now. Or maybe you are. Maybe that's the trick. Learning how to let the sharp edges rest, to move slower, to breathe more deeply. The wind tugs at your sleeves but doesn't chill you. Your body remembers how to walk with the earth, not against it. The forest sighs beside you, still holding your secrets in its bark. Even now, centuries later, someone somewhere plants feverfew because of women like you. Someone grinds rosemary for grief. Someone tells a daughter, try a clove of garlic in your sock, just in case. And someone, maybe you, maybe me, keeps whispering these stories into the dark so they don't get lost. You were never meant to be a name in a book. You were meant to be a ripple, a spark, a thread that weaves through time. And now, you can rest. Not because it's over, but because it finally begins again. Have a sweet dreams.